Hello everybody, this is Capital R speaking, and we are about to begin our very first virtual city tour in Riga, dedicated to probably the most renowned documentary scriptwriter and later director from Latvia, Herz Frank, and a very special short film he worked on. Herz Frank is credited as one of the kingpins of a genre, or call it a movement, called Riga Poetic Documentary Cinema School. And in 1961, a short motion picture called White Bells about a little girl wandering around Riga and looking for small white flowers was released to become a milestone of this genre. Back in the 60s, this school allowed documentalists all over the Baltic states to talk about the age they are living without avoiding the Soviet censorship, or at least trying to avoid, and still looking for answers on eternal or philosophical questions. Questions that the proletariat should have no need to answer at that time. Their language was a poetic cinema, saturated with symbols and metaphors. I must say it was very introvert, typically to us Latvians, yet extremely deep way of looking at the world through themselves. White Bells is extremely significant with this portrait on Riga, and despite being structured as a feature film, it became a documentation of, although sometimes organized, yet life in the capital of Latvia before many things began to change, at least architecturally and from an urban perspective. And at this point, the short is quite a unique artifact of Riga back then. Now 6 years have passed and many things have changed. At first, Mr. Frank is no longer among us since 2013. At second, many of us, including you, the viewer of this video, are probably encapsulated at home during the COVID-19 lockdown taking place all over Europe and also in Riga. Therefore, we at Capital R came up with an idea to take people around the city purposefully and, of course, safely. This route you are about to experience is not unknown to us, since we have done several tours on the given topic before, yet it has never been at full scale like this today. For sure, it does not mean that we will manage to tell every single bit of the story. In fact, since this is our very first virtual gaze on Riga, there might be some little mishaps and slips on the way, but we hope you will forgive us our failures, or most likely will never notice them. We want this video this virtual tour to rather serve as a well-played teaser for everyone to visit places as illuminated in the film and as seen today. So let this video, no longer than an hour, serve you as a visual reminder and a little historical remark to your own journey, sometimes in the future or maybe never. At least when else will you have a possibility to join a city tour when couch potatoing at home today. So, directed by Ivars Kraulītis, another Latvian cinematographer from this poetic school, the script of White Bells was composed by Herz Frank, and this is this stunning young man around the time when it was filmed. A Jewish Latvian born in a town more than 250 kilometers away from Riga called Ludza, and moving to Riga from various places and then leaving later on. And I would like to begin this virtual city tour with a house he lived in Riga since 1960 until 1993 when moving for Jerusalem, where he also died. So this is the address of Large Play Iela number 29. So this is a house where Herz Frank spent 43 years of his life, for a very long period of time. And when you look at this house, you look at the work by Jānis Alksnis, a prominent Latvian architect. At that moment, he was very keen on Riga perpendicular, a type of architecture that usually limits decorations. It's around last 5 years of Art Nouveau period in Riga before the First World War. This one in particular is 1911. And whenever you see a house like this in Riga, it is most likely that period of time. Very aesthetic, to be honest, quite functional for its looks, 20 years earlier before its time. And of course, if you see something like this with mostly two erkers, flat walls and windows formed in that sort of order, it is most likely Jānis Alksnis. This building also received a plaque in 2014 dedicated to this prominent Latvian documentary filmmaker, Herz Frank. And this plaque is still existing, and this plaque is also at some point sometimes a starting point for our tours. Seldom tours, but still. Some of them are very important for us to be told. And I guess we can begin with the movie. And the movie is available at filmers.lv, and it is restored in 2018. And let's see what the movie gives us. And during the short film, we will visit places that we're going to see on it, and we will discuss a little bit about them. And probably there will be also some cases where I will need to indulge into history and look at how the city was performing at some point in a movie and how it is not performing today. But for that, let's give the short motion picture some time. So like I said earlier, this is 1960, 1961. And right now we are looking at another example of Art Nouveau in a city that is kind of important too and good looking. And I can try look it up and see the building in street view. And this is how we are going to do after this house. And the building you see right here in the movie, at least the top of it, is a beautiful piece of decorative Art Nouveau, the early period of it, the first 5 years. This one is 1904, constructed by an ensemble of August Foltz and Heinrich Schiel. And you can see 3 atlases holding earth on their shoulders. And right here you can see the position of the building. It is somehow located opposite to Latvian National Opera and Ballet, and also a hotel that we will, or a part of it we will also see later on. And so this is our first encounter in the movie. A generic look on Old Town and a heavy lorry that will also play part in the movie and will be sort of like an extra to fill up the urban environment later on. This is the next place we're going to look at. And this is a beautiful example of functionalism, or sometimes called neo-eclecticism or neo-historicism in the history of architecture. And we can try looking at it in this address. Let's make it like this. Too far. So we can actually go down to the exact angle you are looking at, but of course you can also look at the facade of the building. And this is late 1930s. Ministry of Finance, back then built for different purposes. And it's very interesting that this is the angle. We can try to compare it. Right. And it's very interesting that the whole space was actually built during the 1930s to fight the German heritage in Old Town. And a lot of people are confused about that times in Latvia when the country was led by Kārlis Ulmanis, an authoritarian person that at some point had methods similar to nationalist governments or nationalist parliaments in Europe, but at some point his way of running the country, although a little bit similar to Hitler, a little bit similar to other fascist and Nazist movements, was totally against German heritage in Old Town. And his idea was that we need to build a new Latvian old city. And you can see Dome Square right here. That was destroyed actually in mid-1930s to create a space for gathering, since Old Town didn't have many of those at that moment. And we can particularly zoom in a bit, and you can see that the square consists of little lines and little bricks. And these are actually the borders of plots where pieces of architecture were located in the square until they were torn down and turned into a public space. And also the whole complex, not this part, not the left part, but mostly the right part of it, was also built on historical heritage left after medieval, Baroque and Rococo periods of time, and Classicism periods of time. So this is the next stop we are looking at, and we are moving on to the next place. A very interesting place that you cannot really reach from this sort of angle, but if you take notice on these two towers and probably this little tower belonging to a house, there is a chance that we can visit a place called Electric Station, the very first proper electric station for the city and the biggest electric station in the Baltic states at that time. And the building was constructed in 1905, and part of it was actually furnished, so to say, by Oskar von Miller, a kingpin of German electro engineering. And if you know a company, AEG or AEG, he was one of the founders of it. But the building itself was constructed by Karl Felsko, who's son by Johann Daniel Felsko. And sadly, in this video you can actually only see this lift, this crane, which is the same crane right here. And sadly, this is an angle that, without telefocus, without lens that zoom in, you cannot enjoy. But yet it appears in a movie. And there is a beautiful empty gap in a movie that you can't see today because it's covered with a grain silo built in the 1970s. But yet you have a possibility to come here and visit the power plant that is now the Museum of Energy. Not looking very good at some point, but an interesting place to visit. So let's look further what the movie uncovers to us. And this is the same square that we already visited, to be honest, when I pointed out the second example of Art Nouveau, a 1904 beautiful piece with atlases holding Earth. So this is how the square between Latvian National Opera and Ballet and between the house and also Hotel Riga looks like. Nothing much has changed. If you go back to the same location today, then the only thing that still exists like it was in 1960 are the cars. And Old Town has very much experienced a plague of motorized vehicles returning and going away and then returning again. And several years ago, there were gates opened to any motorized vehicles to enter Old Town again. And of course, it is not that quiet anymore. Maybe it's very quiet now during the COVID-19 lockdown, when most of Old Town is completely empty. But nothing has changed in the modernist approaches to how the city of Riga is run, and it very much belongs to cars like it belonged in 1960. Of course, there were not that many cars back then, but during the movie you will see multiple places that very much are full with motorized vehicles. The very next place is the railroad bridge that you can see by trying to actually go right here. Right, looks the same. The bridge itself is only a version of another bridge, and the very first bridge being built across the river Daugava that you can see running through Riga was actually built more than 300 years ago. But in 1870s, more particularly 1873, the very first solid bridge was built across the river that you cannot move and they cannot be dismantled and turned into something else. And it looked like a long rectangular box, and it was built for the purposes of railway. And this one would replace it in 1914, and this one would then become railway bridge, and you can see the postament right here. The other bridge would move to this side, and it would belong to, at that time, of course, less cars, but more carriages and people. And later on, of course, there will be also motorized traffic across. And the look of it was and is something like this. So this is how the two bridges look like. And the bridge on left, called Zemgale Stilts or Zemgale Bridge, would actually begin, when we look at this very side of the city, it would begin with the same arches, with the same arcs of metal, and then later on look like it looked originally as this rectangular tube. But things changed in 1914 for this bridge. It was bombed, and then during the first Latvian independence, after the First World War, it was renovated with both the Zemgale Bridge, and then it was bombed. Both of them were bombed in 1941 and then in 1944, and the Zemgale Bridge was never rebuilt again. Instead, we got a bridge you can barely see here, but the stone bridge or Akmens stilts that was opened in 1950s, more or less at the same time when the iron bridge or Dzel stilts was also opened here. So this is another interesting aspect of the city that tells you a little bit of the workers, but also a little bit of something that has not changed. Well, the trains are not running on steam like you saw in the video. This is a very important part of the history of Riga and actually the history of Latvia. And this location is called Āgenskalna Priedes or Āgenskalns Pines. Āgenskalns is a neighborhood this block is built on. And pines is something that reminds us about how this place looked like before anything was built in there. So it literally was a dune with pines turned into a place for sports activities and winter activities. But things changed in 1958 after 1962, when the location you see here in the movie was actually built as the very first Soviet social housing. There were some beginnings of social housing like we see them all around Europe and further in 1930s, but this one is known in particular as the first in Soviet time, and also the one that would launch a lot of microrayons, as we call them, or massive high-rise buildings been built in blocks and out of panels, and sometimes called corn cobs because they are so tight, following up in the next following decades. And if we want to visit this place, there's a nice view. I'm trying to reach it. And this nice view is from the water tower. You cannot sadly see in this film, but the angle is more or less the same here. So this is how the complex looks like. And the very first buildings were made out of bricks like a traditional manner, and they were the good parts of the living space. And then very soon after, panels kicked in, and it turned out to be a first beautiful looking housing, but very soon after not very functional. But anyway, this at that moment would represent the glory of Soviet times, the glory of rationalist architecture, what Nikita Khrushchev, the leader of Soviet Union back then, would emphasize. And very ascetic type of living space, at some point very small, but of course affordable and possibly available to everybody. Sometimes there's this joke that you can move from all over, the anecdote, you can move from all over Soviet Union and you could enter the house and you would know exactly where the toilet is, you would know exactly where the kitchen is, if there is any, and when you send your kids to school, they would most likely know every single class and every single facility at the school, because it all looks very much the same. Not this case though, since it was the first one and celebrates this unique status for that reason. But very soon after, you can see that buildings would very much look like this, and then later on there will be just panels and 9, 12, even higher story buildings built in the city. This is a very unique scene that does not exist for many particular reasons. The first scene is eliminating the view of St. Peter's Church, how it looked like after it was bombed in 1941. So the church in the middle without a tower, as it still looks like in 1960s. That is St. Peter's Church, and we can visit it right now. So the church looks safe and sound, but it did not look safe and sound in 1941, and we will go down to that very soon. But the church itself is built in 1209, not in the looks of this, but of course a smaller version of it. And it was basically built as a church for, in most cases, most of us, the regular people, the merchants and the high-class workers of the city, while other churches, for example, Dome Cathedral was built for the high-class society and the church top-notch people and the kingpins of religion. And this one was basically made for the people. Also, probably that's the reason why in 1524 the Reformation, or the coming of Lutheranism, very much began here in the church. and it caused a lot of things to change in the city. Every single church to become part of Lutheran approach to Christianity, and becoming an orphanage of the parish. And of course it did survive a lot of fires and a lot of burnings and a lot of accidents. To be honest, the rooster you can see here on the top, trying to zoom in, possibly not the best picture, but you got the idea. This rooster is the 7th rooster of a church, while the tower you see here is the 6th tower. Since many of them were built out of wood and caught fire, and also are very attractive to lightning and other particular reasons. And the rooster is actually very famous as being the killer rooster, because in 1666, it's a particular interesting particular year, it would fall down and kill 8 people, walking down the line, not expecting anything bad to happen. But like I said, in 1941, the church would fall itself the last time, and the city would look a little bit different. It's right here. You can see how the church looks, and actually everything around looks after the war. Riga would lose big part of Old Town during the Second World War, and actually before that, and even before that, and some say only 25% of what Old Town would represent some 150 years ago is what still there exists. And in the middle of a square you can see an empty space that would be built over with these living houses right here. Very similar, built in mid-50s by, at that time, the city architect Oswald Stielmanis. And at some point they are criticized because they are too huge for the scale. From the other hand, they very much fit in with the classical look of the city. And this is actually also a very interesting caption of a hotel that's been built right now in the middle of Old Town. There is another hotel being built in the middle of Old Town right here. We lost it, but it's so it's right here. And Google is also very well at preserving some history that also represents how the space where the hotel is almost finished now looked like before, with the whole space that was bombed rebuilt in a little bit postmodern manner, like a little mix of architecture or whatsoever. But you can see the Raadslaukums, or Town Hall Square, right here, with the statue of Rollins. That was actually the only thing that would survive the bombing in 1941, while everything around was in ruins. So that's a little story of this, but also the angle, we're going to look at it a little bit later. The angle would not exist today for another particular reason. The flag of Latvian Socialistic Republic, and this is a view of Riga train terminal, the central terminal of the city. And the view is very fresh back then. It is built and finished around the time when the movie is shot. And we can have a look at it right now. It's trying to catch the right spots. So this is the same entrance, as you can see here. The entrance of the new train terminal, as we call it probably now, today. And I will very soon show you how the old train terminal looked like until 1950s and also a little bit 1960s. The whole space, as you can see it here, is built around 1960, then until 1965. And then it is renovated in 2001 up to 2003, made a little bit glassier. And also the tower is moved for around 2 meters. So it fits with the radial system of streets. And you can see the time also not only when at square, but when standing in several radial streets that begin from the square and or end at the square, and you can see the time also from distance. And it was quite ridiculous when the building was finished. The tower would not fit with the streets, with the street network, and you would only see the time, well, when being at the square. And this is a distant view at the old train terminal, old Riga City train station, and also the view of the angle that does not exist, and very, very soon we will visit that again. And this is where Stockman would be located, and we can visit it very, very soon, trying to reach the right angle of it. But let's say if you go here, you can have a look on this massive supermarket that appeared in the city in 2003. And you can see the same square right here without any supermarket at all. At some point, very modernist approach, huge space, large streets, a lot of area reserved for vehicles, and not much going on when talking about the human scale. The railway itself, when you're going a little bit closer, the railway station that would be from these windows to the right, and we will visit that building very, very soon, would look like this. And we will try to look to the history of this building very, very soon. You shouldn't be doing this, but maybe that's the reason why a lot of men were on the death toll back in the Soviet times, and also are probably the fastest dying part of community also today. But you shouldn't be doing that. The angle you can see here is very particular because the angle does not exist. But at least we can try to reach something that represents it today. It's not going to be the perfect view on this, but we will try to tell the story of what is seen in the video. Right, I'm trying to catch the right angle. It's a little bit close, it's not the same, but it is close. And right here you can see the Science Academy as portrayed in the movie, the Academy of Sciences. and you can see the firefighters department that is barely seen here. And if you go further, there will be a chance for you to also see two churches that you can notice right here on left and on right. The church on left is a church with a name that usually very much explains that this is an Orthodox church, and it's called the Orthodox Church of the Annunciation of Saint Mary. And if you ever see a church with more than 4 words in a name, there is a big chance it is an Orthodox church. In Riga we have few that have 13 words in a name. But this one on the other side is a Lutheran church. Very easy to explain. It's called Jesus Church. And we can try reach both of them. Not in this. But maybe we will have a look at that later. So let's do it manually then. So the Jesus Church is right here. One of the most important wooden churches in the city and also in the country. This is the Orthodox Church of the Annunciation of Saint Mary. Probably I also mistaken the name for its long composition. And the building you can see in the middle here and also in the movie is the Academy of Sciences. I will tell you a short story of this, but if you want to read a little bit more on how it was built through the whole 1950s and how it changed from being a house for the collective farmers and turned into being the Academy of Sciences, there's a chance for you to look for capital R blog, and there is literally a huge article on the history of the house and also the history of the whole block that until late 40s right here looked completely different to how you see it today. But in short, of course, the politics of Soviet Union changed after Stalin died in 1953, when this was started as a house for collective farmers, because that was most likely the future of the nation. And very soon after, Nikita Khrushchev, the next leader, would take over the policies and would build different socialist Soviet Union, and also, well, looking into the future. And what would be the future of back then? Of course, the science. So if you want to get something more about this house, please visit Capital R blog, look for Academy of Sciences in the search field, and you're gonna get probably all, at least most of the answers. And if you don't want to do it, still the tower is one of the best 360 platforms of the city. It is open every single day. It is open until late evening, and it is still probably 2 times cheaper than St. Peter's Church. This is one of the angles we're also going to look at later. A little bit though, but still the train station, the old one, is on the right. And this square we will see very, very soon again. As you can see, it's still very active. And on the bottom left, you can see a space where a little Orthodox church was located. in front of the terminal. And later on, of course, it was turned into an intersection, and then in 2003 disappeared due to the construction of Stockmann supermarket. This is also a very interesting angle on part of a city that kind of does not exist, but at some point exists. And you can also see the entrance of the lorry that we saw at the very beginning of the movie. And this is this interesting place located nearby this address. And sadly, we cannot see this wooden house on right, because sometimes Riga forgets its wooden heritage, and sometimes houses older than 150, sometimes even as old as 200-year-old, located in Old Town, are of no value. And in this case, the house you can barely see here on right was located right here in the center of the picture. And this is just another shopping center called Galleria Riga being built. So there's that. But you also need to keep in mind that we cannot only blame the current architects and city planners. If you look at the vast majority of architecture around, it is Art Nouveau. So that is buildings constructed during the last 15 years before the First World War. And that period of time is very intensively destroying wooden architecture, even more than you can imagine, simply because most of the owners of these houses back then owned a little wooden villa or a little manor or manor house, and it will be torn down to the ground, and there will be a much greater and more profitable example of Art Nouveau being built on top of it. So sometimes it is a beautiful story, sometimes it is nostalgic that we look at history and it looked so great, and the times today is when we lose all of the wooden architecture, but during the Art Nouveau period of time it wasn't so beautiful and so naive as many think. Although right here in the center of the frame you can see probably the very first skyscraper in the city. If we go back to Science Academy that we just experienced, that was literally the very first skyscraper in Riga. But this one, built in 1930s, actually started in 1920s and then in 1930s, was the very first skyscraper according to the regulations of the city. And as you probably look from the bird's view of Riga, you can see that part of the center, a huge part of it, probably most of the center, is very flat. And not talking about terrain, but talking about the stories, the number of stories, and the height of a house. Well, until 1940s, the regulations restricted the height of a house being 21 meters high. And it would save the center, it would make it very uniform. Thus also a lot of people like Art Nouveau from that perspective, when everything fits together with everything, despite the wild imagination that you can see on many facades. But as you can see, this one, type of architecture that more resembles Art Deco, a little bit with functionalism, it would fall out of context, but it would be built anyway because the distance from Old Town is enough. It's decent. So it does not spoil the panorama or the silhouette of the old city. So it also would appear in a movie. This is again an interesting view on Old Town. As you can see, it's pretty busy, but you can also see cars and even trolley buses running through it. And the address that we are looking at is this. Right among KFC, Hesburger, and many other food chains, you can see the same corner. Sadly, cannot fit into the frame correctly, but this is a universal market, or the shopping center, the first shopping center in the country, built in 1938. And this is Old Town, still very full with cars. At least they are not trolleys. And there was no tolerance against motorized vehicles in Old Town back then in the 1960s. And still there is not enough, or actually there is too much tolerance of cars today. And many streets in Old Town would actually be turned into proper motorized lanes like this one. And here's the moment where I would like to say hi to my friend Lee, that you can see in the middle, riding a bike with his daughter. Hopefully that's him. If not, then still hi Lee. This is where we begin the story of the girl with Opieop passage. And we're just gonna wait until the girl comes in the story. That's her. And the gates you see here are located on this address. Right. So these are the same gates that you can see in a movie. And the space you can see here is called Opieop passage. And a lot of people mix it up, at least in Latvia, with a writer of the same last name, but it has nothing to do with it. It's just another Opietis. And Opieop passage is just another living shopping and culture complex in a city, been built before the First World War in 1913. And it takes a lot of space that we can actually see from bird's view. And you can literally call it a complex. And there's nothing wrong about it. And Opieop passage is located right in the center of the frame now. On the right side, where you can see a Soviet block been built again in, if I'm not wrong, in 1970s. There will be a plan to build a concert hall or public space and restaurants for the people. It did not succeed because the First World War would stop everything. Yet the space right here at the bottom is not a car park anymore, but Opieop passage moves on, and he has grown a little bit into a more contemporary type of architecture. But as you can see, big part of the block belongs to the whole complex, and despite it looking very beautiful and seemingly also being very expensive, in the movie this is what you can see, not looking expensive at all, rather middle class or lower class. But as you all know, during the Soviet time, there were no, at least visually, no classes like that. And there would be a chance that in a very beautiful and expensive and high-class house, there will be very interesting families with not much of qualities at the architecture, or towards architecture. So this is the hero we will be looking at, and this is actually a very beautiful angle of the city that you cannot see anymore, and I will show you that in a second. It's basically right here. So the wooden house, you can see this interesting erker you can see with rusts. It is the same house right here. And this is the same street. This is Alexander Čaka iela, named after a very famous local poet. And this was covered in cobblestones until 1960s. And this was still a street for tramway until the same time. And the first trams in Riga came in 1885, then they were switched to 1901 to electric trams driven by electricity. And the ones that you see here are very much an artifact of history. A tram that does not exist in looks, but also a tram that does not exist even in the urban environment today. There is another unique angle that very much resembles something you could not film during the Soviet time. And I can take you there very easily, but I would not be able to take you there during the Soviet time. So the angle is right here. Oh, it's more or less the same. Let's just zoom a bit further. And this is the Freedom Monument, or the Statue of Liberty, Monument of Independence, call as you want it. We call it the Freedom Monument. And this will be probably the maximum of what you can get out of during the Soviet times, since it was a kind of a forbidden part of the city to be filmed due to its nationalistic and patriotic background. It was erected in 1935 as, of course, a statue for our independence, but also as a remembrance stone for all of the freedom fighters that fought for our independence during the First World War and several years after. And during the Soviet time, of course, it would disappear, or should, or ought to disappear. But due to several legends, due to several discussions and counting of art worlds, it survived. Still, it could not be filmed. And it's interesting that it could still manage to appear in a movie just for a little bit. And this is a little bit of the train terminal, or at least the block of the train terminal, that I cannot tell you a story about because it was almost entirely destroyed in mid-1960s. And there is a chance for me, of course, to show you this photo that I already showed you a little bit earlier. And the train terminal you can see in the center, and of course the building itself on the right, is how the train terminal looked like since its very beginnings. And when I say the very beginnings, I mean 1860s, the central house right here. And then in the 1880s and then in 1910s it would grow bigger and larger and would turn into this beautiful white, partially white piece of historicism or eclecticism, depends where you live at. And the architect would be Heinrich Schell. Again, the architect that would also build the house with the 3 atlases. And nothing of this you can see here exists anymore, at least, well, from the railway. The Ministry of Traffic, the White House on the top right is still there. The other houses on the left are still here, but the whole complex was then turned into a railway and the train station, as you can see here, and built into a more modernist and not bad looking type of architecture. And if you look at the bird's view map here, then the White House should be located where I'm actually pointing out now, next to Stockmann. And it is not, of course, sadly, here anymore. Despite the urban environment, there is another beautiful element that can be very seldom seen today: the chimney sweepers. And some of them are working in their profession still for 60 years in Riga, but let's see if the profession survives when we switch to electric heating and other modernist approaches to amenities at homes. And this is just a little stop of our house. You can see here we will encounter the same crossroad again, but this is just a beautiful piece of architecture we can visit, and it's located very, very near, and it's located where Lido is. Probably you've heard about this Latvian countryside food chain. But the house itself, the house where this young couple is entering, is right here. This one, or at least the house next to it. But the one that you see here is a beautiful example of functionalism from 1931, and Mr. Klinklavs is the architect of it, and the owner of this was, if I'm correct, August Rudzītis, a guy who also had a wooden house, a very old one, and it was another eatery that he would tear down, and then in 1931 turn into something high class, like this building. Well, sometimes when you look at people, they do not look that bad at that moment. Times are getting better until they end in 1960s with a lot of restrictions to the art world and a lot of restrictions to living conditions. And there's sometimes the saying that a lot of people have a lot of money, but they have nothing to buy, and the stagnation would turn in very, very soon. The cobblestones you can actually see here are not older than 150 years, since the first organized paving of streets only began in 1850s. But if you see these brick stones, then most likely they are from not older than 150 years. Just a little glimpse on what's been done on Alexander Chaka Street and its beginnings, Maris Street. So you can already see that part of the railway space and part of the street is turned into the modernist street with asphalt, and very, very soon trams will disappear as the cobblestones. So there's a first encounter with a flower shop that is located again in a place that does not exist anymore today. And yet it does not stop, of course, for the girl to fall in love with her very first white bells. I'm getting poetic here. So right here there's a corner that is very much related to the flower store that you just saw, and a corner that does not exist in the shape as you can see it today. And we can go back to Elizabeth Street, and it's very nearby where we were looking at before. And to find the right angle, the corner now looks like this. The opposite of the house of flower market is the same, but the whole space that you can see here is now turned into a massive hotel. And it's not to blame the capitalistic world. The hotel actually exists here since 1960s, at least in thoughts, and since 1970s when the actual building began. In late 1970s it was finished as Hotel Latvia, and it was the biggest hotel in the country back then, and it was made for international guests. Then, of course, things changed, and in 2001 and later on in 2006, it was reconstructed and turned into what you can see today, or modernized at some point. Of course, it does not change the fact that the whole block would disappear. Would disappear in the 1970s, and sadly, the angle you can see in the movie cannot represent for you in real time today. Bad luck, girl. Bad luck. But of course, as you will see very, very soon, she does not give up, and she goes for other resources and means to get the flowers. So this crossroad might not be at some point important architecturally, but it is important to those who lived through Soviet times, or at least known to those who lived through Soviet times. And the crossroad actually is just right here. next to the hotel. And opposite the crossroads there is this space, now with an arguable example of artwork located in the middle of it, but from 1950 up to 1991, 24th of August to be more precise, this location looked like this, and there was a statue of Lenin located right here in the middle of the boulevard. And you can see a little bit of the last generation trams from the Soviet era that would also storm the city, or phantom through the city, still in 1990s and beginning 2000s. The bus in the middle you can see is the famous Icarus. It sometimes was yellow, it sometimes was red, white, red, but in most of the cases it was a pretty bad bus or trolley bus. Bad luck again, this is locked, and I just wonder why there were so many flower markets, flower shops in the city, but who knows. This is actually the same crossroad that we met already, with the beautiful functionalism example from 1931. And actually a man in a car is, if I'm correct, Aldis Browns. And he's also one of the most important people in the Riga Poetic documentary cinema school. And this is just one of the examples of the Soviet car making, bulky and then large but good looking, and of course most likely a copy of something from the capitalistic world. And sometimes there was a joke during the Soviet time when the grandparents, or most likely a granddad, would flip a car in a ditch. Would be more like a car accident, and if you were there as a grandchild in a car, he would most likely say that don't say anything about this to your granny, because there was not a scratch to the car, and it was made out of so thick metal that you would never feel the difference of something happening to it. We are now following a truck that will take her to Central Market very, very soon. But this is probably one of the only places you can see a little bit of the actual old train station that we already examined a bit earlier. And there might be reasons why a lot of strategic objects like these could not appear in movies. One of the reasons was, of course, the reason of security. Strategic objects like train terminals, like bus stations, like bridges, like airports, they could not appear fully anywhere for the reason of security and safety. And of course it's very interesting how the operator and director and the crew managed to capture the Iron Bridge in the beginning of the movie. So this is the same square, the train terminal square, And this is this place where the very last crossroad over this whole block of streets was located, still in mid-2000s. And then it was also turned into a tunnel, something that was criticized 15-20 years ago by West urbanists and still is very criticized today. And the activity of the street was crazy back then, still also was crazy when the tunnel was created. But very, very soon you will see that there are multiple places where actual zebras are located, where you can cross over and the traffic is slowed. And above the bridge there was also a writing in Russian that we passed by, but it was basically like, those working in Riga, let's meet the new approaching 22nd 5-year plan with new working achievements. And now we are in a part of Riga Central Market. And the part is the flower market. And still exists, but it does not look that beautiful, and it is not that packed with stalls and aisles and tables. In fact, part of this is already gone, and part of it's been replaced with postmodern, cheap quality composite material boxes that are actually being torn down right now due to actually being built illegally and due to illegal things happening there, like selling contraband or bootleg cigarettes and not paying taxes, etc., etc. But the Riga Central Market still exists, and it's one of the most important places to visit. It was not the most important place to visit 15 years ago, especially for tourists, because a lot of local guides were not very fond of the place. And the place, of course, was also not looking very great. It was slightly dodgy, it was slightly shabby, it was a little bit laid down, it was a lot of haggling, it was a lot of discussing and debating about the price. You sometimes would not trust the sellers. And of course, it would also be a little bit full with petty crime. People would be pickpocketed, and all of that would bring a not very nice picture to the market. But then a lot of alternative tour guides saw that as a beautiful place to visit anyways, because it represents the authenticity, the local atmosphere that still has this unique taste, and of course the most important thing you can see here, the locals. People that actually are living in the city and opposite to Old Town are not just passing by, but very much taking this location constantly. This is a place nearby the market that also kind of does not exist in this sort of location. It's very, very hard for me to show this on maps, but I guess you understand the beauty of also the impressiveness of the location. And before we go any further, of course, a little story about the market, since we are slowly kind of going away from it very, very soon. And I will rather show you the market from this perspective right here. So it consists of 5 pavilions and a whole space right here. This all belongs to the market, and this is the ugly, shabby area that's been torn down now, where a lot of buildings were built illegally, a lot of illegal things were happening, and etc., etc. But of course, this is what you're going to mostly visit, the 5 pavilions, being built from 1924 till 1930, and at that moment when they were opened, they were the most modern market in Europe probably, and still is one of the biggest covered markets in Europe. when talking about the space and the size of the space. This one, the separate one, once was an exhibition space where in 1930s you can see pretty pricey cars being being put on display. Now it's a meat pavilion, and this one is fruit. This one is milk. In the middle, this is bread or bakery, and also now a food court that a lot of people have mixed feelings about. Then the third one is fruit and veg, a very favorite to many. And the last one is, of course, as I always say, the smelliest place in the world, which is fish and seafood. And the market has this very distinctive look. It got from something quite far from Riga. And these are two Zeppelin hangars that were located 186 kilometers away from Riga in Vainjorda. And it was a military area for Zeppelins, for the dirigibles, the blimps, until the end of the First World War, and they were owned by German army. And then they were, of course, cut in pieces, and only the roofs were moved, or part of the roofs were moved, while the base of the market was built in this Art Deco, slightly functionalist, but mostly Art Deco style. So when someone says, or claims that there were Zeppelin hangars here, most likely the person has never seen Zeppelins himself, and most likely this is just another urban myth he's heard somewhere, because the facts are slightly different. Still, the Riga Central Market is a place we very much recommend to visit. We also have covered that in another article in the Capital Riga blog, article about markets. And this actually is an angle that also does not exist in its past looks. And we will try to see it now, since there are no roads going on, but there's one person helping us very much. Thanks, Mr. This and That. So he actually captured this whole space. How, well, there's him again, right? Thank you. So this is the place, or approximately the place that you can see here. That was, again, very much changing after 2003, when Stockmann, the great massive supermarket, and also the movie theater were built soon after. And this very debatable type of architecture called Titanic that hopefully will sink very, very soon. But very much the area you can see here looks the same. The canal you can see next to the girl exists here for 150 years. And it was a canal built where there was a fortification, ramparts around the city, around Old Town. And if you want to have a look on them, they can be very easily seen here. So this is basically the canal, and this is a line where the fortress or the fortification of the city would be still until 1850s. When, of course, walls became modern and fortresses became useless, or city walls became useless. And that was actually the time when Riga starts to grow, turning into a metropole of industry before the First World War, the second biggest in Europe, some say. Growing number of people from 70,000 in 1860s, 1850s, 1860s, until becoming a massive city of 540,000 people only in 50 years. And I'm not really sure there are many cities like that in the world now. Well, maybe except in China, when cities grow very, very fast. But Riga was unique at that moment. Also was, if you look at the Russian Empire back then, it's a massive part of the Eurasian continent. Riga was the fourth biggest citadel after Moscow, St. Petersburg, Kiev, Kharkiv, and we were the fourth. So this bridge still exists. We can visit it. On the left there will be the bus terminal, and on the right there will be Titanic, something that you already know that I despise. And this is this interesting place where we can still see a crossroad across 13. Janvāra iela very soon. That is replaced with a tunnel by mid-1960s, if I'm correct. And it is located right here. There's now a tunnel system that connects this central market, Stockman and bus station area with Old Town, with something in the middle. And back then, of course, there is non-regulated crossing, which of course is very dangerous and is one of the only reasons, to be honest, to be turned into tunnels, because a lot of accidents happen, fatal accidents happen on these crossroads. Still, a lot of urbanists are very much looking forward to return to at least regulated crossroads in a city, in multiple places where they are gone for half a century. And this will be one of the places. And we are closing in the last minutes of the movie. And the last minutes, of course, are very emotional, but also full of cheating. And the way that a girl moves is not very geographically correct. And I will kind of tell you where she ends up. So this is the market, and she would end up right here where I'm pointing with the cursor, and she actually now is right here, running through the city, and then you will see that she will go the opposite direction of the city again. But anyway, this is a very short glimpse on this crossroad right here. And this is just to mention that the White Belts movie also was shot a little bit in the quiet center. And the building you can see on the left is a beautiful, very old example of historicism from 1883. And on the right, you can see basically the opposite to it. In 1910, the neoclassical moment when architecture became so crazy and so beautiful and so experimental. A lot of banks and then offices just wanted to go the classical way. And as you can see, the girl has lost her white bells, and she's ready for the second cheat that comes just very soon. Oh, this suspense is crazy. And you can see this flattener, probably that's the correct name of it. And it stops right here next to a very beautiful, very good looking background architecture that is actually the opposite of the city center. So we were just here, and we are actually going down to here. And for a little girl, she would probably die by running this distance in such a short period of time. But it's not the only thing she can. She can have something else too. But anyway, this is the correct angle is right here. So this is the same house you can see here. Of course, it looks slightly worse today. The building itself is enormous, and it's a beautiful representation of national romanticism, being built in 1909 by one of the most prominent architects of its time and probably most famous architects in Latvia at that time in the world, called Ivars Kraulītis. And this whole complex consists of 6 plots, with the central plot on Large Pleasure Street actually belonging to him, and with his office being located in the building. And if we go to the bird's view, you can actually see how huge the area was. So these are the 6 plots: number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4, number 5, and number 6, or probably number 6 right here. And this whole massive area, of course, does not belong to one person anymore, I believe, but still is, like I said, a great example of national romanticism. Mid 1905, 1910 period of Art Nouveau that belonged to a lot of experiments of realization of Latvian identity that was not very much examined until that time in architecture particularly. And if you go to Finland, to Helsinki, you can see a lot of buildings like that also being built there in the same period of time and the same motive, trying to go back to our roots, trying to tell the story of modern architecture through a perspective of national identity, history, folklore, trying to tell stories sometimes that are not related to Christianity or any other mass religion, but is very much indulged into paganism or Latvian, or in this case also Finnish national symbols. And it is said that Ivars Kraulītis was also very much inspired by the Finnish architects when creating this beautiful large example. And as you can see, this is important. You can see that it all happens here, and the massive traffic jam is piling up. Everybody wants to help the little girl, and of course the traffic is stopped, and the girl is very happy having the bells. And this should be a happy ending for most of the people, except the urban explorers that actually will bring you down to a complete different place that is not located here, and that is also very far from where we were here, and that is actually right here on this corner. So I'll try to find the correct angle. So this is where it all takes place. And this is Riga Street, probably one of the longest streets in the city, the central streets at least. And you cannot see the exact angle in Google Maps, but you can still, of course, imagine this beautiful look right here. And this is basically the end of the movie. Happy ending. With the traffic jam, of course. And with a massive lorry also appearing. Actually, a carriage appearing with the pipes. So the cycle has ended. So is the very first virtual city tour in the history of capital R, and probably one of the very first urban city tours in the history of Riga 2. Just a little glimpse, of course, this is the same Alexander Chaka Street. This is the same rustic house you can see, and the same trams, the same cobblestones that are still existing there until mid-1960s. Science Academy, a little view from Argenskans. Happy ending. So this is the end of Herz Frank and White Bells Riga 60 Years Apart virtual tour. I hope you enjoyed. The video will be available very, very soon after to be experienced again on our YouTube channel. If you want to follow any new activities, please subscribe us. Also, you can follow us on Facebook, where we will most likely post any other new events related to virtual or actual city tours. And very soon we will try to surprise you with something new that we have kept up our sleeves for a very long time, and most likely will uncover during this beautiful COVID-19 time of Latvian and European history. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and see you later.